House prices are not going down because commissions are getting suppressed. What am I talking about? Well, there's this belief out there because the National Association of Realtors has finally settled with the Department of Justice regarding so-called fixed commissions and adjusting it to a more flexible commission structure, that somehow sellers are now going to lower their price since they're not having to pay those commissions, and ultimately it's going to become more affordable for buyers. And unfortunately, for those thinking that, it's simply not true. Well, that's actually what I want to talk about in today's video. I more or less want to address that myth that somehow sellers no longer paying commissions is going to lower house prices. Now, I do realize that affordability sucks. House prices are high. Interest rates are high, which means we have a lot less able buyers out there in the market. And because of those factors alone, there's this belief that home prices have to come down so that everyone can afford a house. Along with the settlement between the National Association of Realtors and the Department of Justice and how it removes restrictions on how commissions are advertised as well as negotiated, there's this belief out there that not only is it going to increase competition amongst agents and lower commissions for sellers, but that somehow house prices are also going to come down in the process. So I want to start today's video by acknowledging that belief that sellers only paying one side of the commission is actually going to bring house prices down. But before we do that, I'd like to take a minute and ask a favor. If you find any value in my videos at all, do me a favor and smash that like button. And if you want to stay updated on everything real estate related, do me a favor and subscribe to the channel. As a real estate broker for nearly 20 years, not only helping first-time home buyers, but also helping sellers list and sell their homes. And the reason I bring this up is because I've had the opportunity to sit down with a lot of sellers over my career. And one of the very first questions I ask a potential seller when I'm sitting down at that table is, what are you trying to accomplish by selling your home? What is the ultimate goal with selling this property? And on top of that, I'm asking, what is most important to you in the process? And 9 times out of 10, the seller says that price is the most important thing to them. And the reason I bring that up is because we aren't starting the conversation when talking with a seller by talking about commissions. We start by talking about what their home is worth. And how do we determine, as a listing agent, as a listing broker, what someone's home is actually worth? Well, we actually go back and look at comparables. We're trying to find similar properties in a similar condition in a similar location that is sold within a recent time frame. Ideally, we'd like to find a model match to that property that's closed on the same street within the last couple of days, but oftentimes that's not realistic. So typically we'll go out 3 months, potentially 6 months, trying to find comparable homes. And by doing that, we often have to adjust for time frame as well as different things in the market. But one thing we never adjust for, at least on my side, is we never take into account commissions when we're trying to determine the price of a home. And the primary reason for that is because commissions are more or less a sunk cost when it comes to selling a property. Yes, there is typically a buyer's agent compensation that we have always been able to see on the multiple listing service. Now, going forward, as of the middle of June, that commission is actually going to be removed entirely from the MLS. So as a buyer's agent, you're no longer going to be able to see if that seller is paying a commission, and if so, what they're actually paying. And the reason I bring this up and the reason that it's really, really important is because we don't ever see what the listing agent is charging to list a home. We only ever see the buyer's agent's compensation. And as I mentioned earlier, we're not adjusting what we think someone's home is worth based on the compensation that they paid to the buyer's agent. Rather, we're actually looking to see what that home sold for and how our home, the subject property that we're talking about, compares to that property. And once the seller and I confirm that we're on the same page with the price, the next thing that I typically like to do is get the seller a seller estimated net sheet, if you will, what they're going to walk away with if that home sells at the price that we've determined. And on that seller net sheet, it goes over all of the fees that essentially that seller is likely to see in selling that home. Title, escrow, wire transfer, county taxes, all of those sort of things, in addition to the commissions that are being charged. Now, one thing I forgot to mention is in that earlier conversation before we get this net sheet, we've already discussed commissions. We already have talked about commissions, what I charge as a listing agent and what I recommend them pay to the buyer's agent. So we have already discussed that. We've already agreed on a number, and those numbers will be referenced in that seller net sheet. Now, one thing I will say in 20 years of discussing commissions with sellers is that the seller doesn't always go with what I recommend on paying one side or another. In fact, oftentimes I have to negotiate my own commission by showing the seller how I provide value, how I'm going to make them more money through exposure, through marketing, and by ultimately creating demand on that property. But nevertheless, understand that commissions have always been negotiable. So this idea out there that commissions have been fixed this entire time and it was never negotiable is an absolute lie. I've never walked into a listing presentation where there wasn't some sort of conversation around commissions. And more often than not, the seller doesn't always agree with my recommendation. So we're having to adjust, we're having to negotiate, and that's exactly what you're going to see going forward. But most of you watching this video aren't really worried about that piece of the puzzle. You're wondering how the seller no longer having to pay these commissions is going to reflect in the price. And that's the primary reason I brought up how that presentation works. Because as I mentioned earlier, the price isn't determined by how much the seller is paying in compensation. The price is determined by what the comparable sales in the neighborhood are actually selling for. So understand, we start with price and then we work our way down, paying out commissions, paying out all of these different fees to figure out what the seller is actually going to walk away with. In fact, I've only been on a few listing presentations in my entire life where the seller has said, this is what I owe on the property, this is all the fees that are being charged, this is what you're charging, this is the number that I want to list my home at so that I can get all of those expenses paid and walk away with this amount of money. Rarely does that ever happen. And that's because commissions are a sunk cost that's already factored into the listing price. So going forward, sellers no longer have to pay this buyer's agent commission based on this recent settlement. Now, it hasn't been approved yet, but chances are it's going to get approved and it's going to happen sometime midsummer. But let's fast forward to that time and say that sellers no longer are paying buyer's agent's commission. And I walk into a listing appointment and homes have still been selling at whatever price in the neighborhood. And we say, hey, let's figure out what your home is worth. So what we do is we go out and we look at the comparable sales in the neighborhood and we say, hey, this is what your home is worth. Again, we talk about commissions. Now you're only paying, one side of the commission in this case. So when we get that seller net sheet, it's actually going to show a little bit more money to the seller because they're no longer paying that buyer's agent commission in this case that we're using. So when that happens, do you think the seller is going to say, you know what, since I'm no longer paying that buyer's agent's commission, I'd actually like to lower the price. I'd like to take 2%, 2.5%, 3% off the price. Since I'm no longer paying that agent, I can adjust my price downward. No, that's not going to happen. And the reason that's not going to happen is because sellers are looking to maximize price when they sell their home. So in that case, if sellers are not lowering their prices because they're no longer paying that buyer's agent commission and homes are still selling at whatever price and home prices continue to go up, which they're going to because we have a lack of supply in the market and buyer demand is still high and we're going to have interest rates coming down at some point this year into 2025, which means buyer demand is going to pick up. And in turn, house prices are likely going to continue going up as well. Now, they're probably not going to increase at the levels that we've seen over the last couple of years, but you are likely to see home prices continue to rise somewhere between 2, 3, 4, even 5%. And in no world do I see a seller that's no longer paying that buyer's agent commission going, you know what? I feel really bad for these sellers having to pay commission. I'm just going to lower the price to make it more affordable for them. That's not going to happen. In fact, I believe that a lot of sellers are still going to pay the buyer's agent commission, assuming the Department of Justice allows that to continue to happen. And the reason that sellers are going to pay most of the buyer's agent commission in many cases out there is because it's going to make them more competitive on the market. It's going to help them stand out from the competition. And if it doesn't help them stand out from the competition, it keeps them in line with the competition. What if you're in a neighborhood where 2 of your 3 neighbors are paying a commission for a buyer's agent and you're not paying that buyer's agent commission? And yet you're still trying to get the same price for that home? Well, guess what? The buyers are likely going to go to the homes where the buyer's agent commission is covered and they're not having to come up with that money out of pocket. Which means in some cases that buyer's agent commission is still going to be factored in to those overall numbers that the seller's receiving. But in the case that the neighbors aren't paying a commission and you are, do you think the neighbors are going to lower the price of their homes because they're not paying that commission? Or are they going to price it according to your home because it's a comparable property? Now, I can't speak for sure because this hasn't happened yet, but what I can tell you is from a listing agent perspective, I would tell that seller to price their home according to fair market value based on the comparable sales and not get pulled into this idea that because commissions are changing, that the price of your home is going to change. Now, I realize watching a video like this can be discouraging from a buyer perspective because housing affordability, again, is really, really low. Interest rates haven't come down quickly enough. And this whole idea that now you have to pay buyer's agent compensation in some cases, making it more expensive, makes it less than ideal to be a homeowner at this market. Well, in that case, if demand backs off because of all of these changes in the market and you just have less demand out there and supply continues to increase over time, well, then if you have that imbalance between supply and demand, where there's way more supply than there is buyer demand, in that case, then you could see home prices move lower. And as I've mentioned in other videos, home prices can't continue to increase every single year. At some point, you need home prices to pull back a bit to get in line with that 4.6% that we've seen over the last 65 years. So if you are somebody that's considering buying a home, I would say worry less about trying to pick the top and the bottom in home prices or about the idea of buying a home and the value going down. The reality is if you buy a home and the value goes down, nothing happens as long as you continue to make your payment. But at the same time, you shouldn't be buying a home unless you have money in the bank, unless you have reserves, unless you have that longer term time horizon, because there is a lot of volatility out there in the market. There are a lot of changes happening. And that's why it's super, super important that you're focusing on the things that you can control. If you're looking to buy a home in 2024, then you need to check out this video right here.